Hey everybody, Winter here. A while back, I was talking with somebody about an event that took place in China during World War II, where the KMT blew the dams of the Yellow River in an attempt to flood a massive part of the country to slow down the Japanese advance. And I was one of the points I was making is that I kind of thought you might see something like that in the China at War expansion, but it wasn't in there, and that's fine. But somebody asked me, it's like, okay, well, if they were to put that in there, what do you think it would look like rules wise? And so I thought about it for a little bit, and I went ahead and I wrote some kind of like idea. I wrote an idea down and I sent it off, and I said, well, this is what I think it would look like, but I never really had a chance to play test it. So with that in mind, I kind of decided, well, let me go ahead and just do a video about what I thought it might look like rules-wise, and just kind of put it out there to the general community and see kind of how people feel about it and get some feedback. Now, one thing to keep in mind is I wrote this up without play testing it. And I will explain my logic behind some of it, one way or the other. But it's not, there may be major flaws that I just hadn't thought through yet, which is I would like to hear back about, like, oh, hey, I think this is going to be a problem, or this is going to be a problem, or what about this? I perfectly welcome that with this in this instance. So this is what I had in mind. So destroying the Yellow River Dam. Either the CCP or KMT player may choose to destroy the Yellow River Dam at any point during the game outside of combat, so long as they possess Hopei and are at war with Japan. When the dam is destroyed, the player who has units each player who has units in Shangtong rolls a number of dice equal to the number of ground units they have present. For each 1 to 2 rolled, a ground unit owning player's choice is removed as a casualty. Regardless of which faction destroys the dam, the land zone of Shangtong is now considered to be marsh terrain for the remainder of the game. Additionally, the railroad facility in Hopei is destroyed, not just damaged. Now, the KMT consequences of destroying the dam. For the remainder of the game, the CCP gained +1 bonus to the target number of all recruitment rolls, but only so long as the KMT is not surrendered. CCP consequences of destroying the dam. For the remainder of the game, KMT does not suffer from attack weakness when attacking the CCP. And then I made a note here about the Partisans expansion. Regardless of which faction destroyed the dam, the CCP may make a partisan recruitment roll within Shantong for the remainder of the game. So that's it. It's pretty simple and straightforward. But it can potentially have a big impact. Now, obviously, let me go into a little bit of the history about what kind of motivated me. And I generally don't do this, but in this case, I think it's really interesting. So naturally, the population of the affected area were angry, if they were still alive, that is, at the massive act of deliberate death and destruction. Many blame Japan, but many also blame the KMT. Some people actually turned around and helped the invading Japanese out of spite. Others sided with the CCP, and they used this event as a recruitment propaganda for years afterwards. So when I wrote these rules, I wrote them as a kind of a rounded up situation. Historically, the overall impact of the flood on the Japanese advance is arguable. It did slow them down, but without any doubt, but they managed to overcome many of the problems it created faster than the KMT had anticipated. So taking that into account, I rounded up the possible impact of the flood in order to give an interesting option to the Chinese players. Permanently reducing the IPP value of Shangtong makes sense. However, I think blowing the dam becomes almost a no-brainer move at that point in order to deny Japanese close to a dozen IPP throughout the game. So the destruction was pretty big, and they did not repair those dams until after several years after the war. So yeah, and when you look at the maps of the flood area, it is kind of, arguable, like where the dams were blown and what areas would have been affected, because some of the maps show it coming well down here into the northern part of Hunan, and over here into Hopei and some of these other places. But I kind of said, okay, well, let's start with this, which is what I wrote, and go from there. And if playtesting shows maybe we need to do something else with it, or beef it up a little, or maybe rein it back, well, then great, that's what we'll do. So in a nutshell, you have to control Hopei. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. And it has to be outside of combat. You have to make the decision to blow the dams. And then anybody who has units here has the potential to lose casualties. Now, the casualty numbers of estimated Japanese that died during the flood is pretty staggering. But it's also really difficult to get a concise number. This is a historical event that wasn't well documented given the war and the time period. But in later years, it became, there's propaganda reasons post-war to kind of beef up the numbers and make it seem more effective than it was, and vice versa. So in the end, though, I figured that both sides, KMT and the CCP, suffer some consequence for this. Okay. Japan suffers a consequence. Now, both sides can suffer the consequence if this area becomes marsh, because that can inhibit both sides. Let's say Japan comes in, has a really bad game, ends up withdrawing. Well, this is still marsh. And I don't want any, and I don't think it's a good idea, and given the historical nature of it, or what actually happened, I don't want this repairable or fixable within the course of the game. I think that this is a decision that has to stick with the board, and it has to be dealt with by both sides for the rest of the game. So making that marsh can inhibit movement by both sides into that area. It destroys the actual rail marshalling yards in that area, so you have to rebuild them from the ground up. So that's at least a couple bucks out of Japan, assuming that they're going to want to do that. They may not care. Or later on, maybe this KMT needs to do it because, well, they kicked Japan out, but now that rail area is broken, it's making things a lot more difficult to move up and down the coast. And just normal movement. It's not flat terrain anymore, and it becomes a lot more difficult for vehicles or any sort of fast-moving unit to kind of get through there. So those are my thoughts. Now, I did mention the absolute amount of destruction. It makes sense to permanently reduce the IPP value to 1. However, unless there's more tweaking, I think that every Chinese player will do it regardless. It's as simple as that. They're just going to do it because that's such a huge blow to Japan in the long run. Even if Japan doesn't come into China all the way and they just want to take the coastal territories, that's still really difficult. I think it's it becomes a no-brainer, too lopsided at that point. So those are my thoughts about how those rules might work. Like I said, there's a lot of wiggle room there about how that might work out, how that should work out, how the wording should go, even the locations involved. So give me some feedback on what you guys think. And yeah, this is Wintermute out.